Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome to Point of View. This is Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and we have got a jam-packed program today. I'm excited about this first hour. In my first hour, our guest is going to be Dr. Sterling Burnett. Now, I've known Sterling for a long time. We both worked at the National Center for Policy Analysis, a think tank that was based in Dallas. We worked there for a number of years together. I've moved on to the Institute for Policy Innovation later, and Sterling moved on to the Heartland Institute based in Chicago, where he works on a number of issues, but primarily focuses on environmental issues there. So today we're going to be talking about the environment, the environmental movement, and the Green New Deal. So I'm excited about this. Sterling, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Merrill.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. Let's start out a little bit, because there's so much news about the environment these days. We've got Democratic presidential candidates who want to have a debate focused strictly on the environment. Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State, who's running for president, wants to make that the key focus of his campaign. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says if we don't do something within 10 or 12 years, we're all dead. We're all gonna die. Yep. We've got this movement going on, and when the press covers this, they look at anybody who raises questions or wants to know a little more, and they just accuse them of being a climate change denier. It's not just with scorn; it's almost like with hatred in their voice.
It is, yeah. Now let's clarify, because it's not about the environment. They don't want to talk about the environment because they don't want to talk about the implications of the policies they're promoting on the environment. They talk about climate change, a very narrow area of the environment, and as you say, they label in science. If you understand science, skepticism is the hallmark of science. You test theories.
At least it used to be.
Yeah, well, it used to be. Climate science, as far as I can tell, is the only area of science, and maybe I'm wrong. I don't look at a lot of other areas of science. But it's the only area of science where when theory and data collide, rather than saying, okay, the data don't confirm the theory, let's question the theory and change it, they say, there must be something wrong with the data, and let's massage the data until we get the answers that we know we should be getting. And so anyone who raises questions about the tripartite claim that the climate is changing, humans are responsible for it, and it's catastrophe, it will kill us all if we don't do something about it. Those are the 3 points. If you raise questions about any one of those points, you're called a denier, because they want to tar you with the implication that you're like a Holocaust denier. Mm-hmm. The Holocaust is a fact. It's history. We know it. Projections of climate change are not facts.
They're future.
they're future. And in fact, they've been making projections for 20 years, and they've routinely been wrong for 20 years.
Yes, indeed.
So they don't get the most basic projection is temperature. I mean, that's driving the whole thing, supposedly, is the temperature should be rising, and they should be rising by a projected amount. They're not rising by that projected amount. In fact, for 18 years, they weren't rising at all during the midst of the climate change hysteria. And so climate models, which they rely on rather than data, because data undermines them, they didn't get the past right. They don't get the present right, but we're told to trust their projections for 100 years in the future.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the things where we would generally agree. I mean, when they say you're a climate change denier, the implication is you don't believe the Earth is warming, but I think you and I would both agree that the Earth has been on a gradual warming trend with some ups and downs since the end of the Ice Age. That's why we're not in an Ice Age now, is because there's no the Earth has been on a gradual warming trend, and that's been for thousands of years.
Well, actually, early on after the Ice Age, it didn't warm gradually. It warmed about 9 degrees in 50 years. Pretty substantial.
Yes.
Compared to the estimated, if we double carbon dioxide 2 degrees over the course of over 150, 200 years, which it has happened, you've had those, as you mentioned, fluctuations. So here's where I think we have some agreement. The climate changes.
Mm-hmm.
The Earth is warming modestly, or has warmed modestly over the last 150 years or so. Carbon dioxide levels are increasing. There's no question about that. Humans are putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Whether that is driving the modest warming is very much debatable. The extent to which humans are contributing to climate change is debatable. I suspect that they are to some degree, though not through CO2 emissions, but to other local changes. For instance, we sit in Dallas, Texas, a city of 3 to 5 million people now.
In the Metroplex.
Yeah, in the Metroplex. 150 years ago, this was called part of the Southern Great Plains.
Mm-hmm.
Buffalo were roaming here, and the climate was different. We didn't get as much rain. We didn't have trees. We now have 200,000 acres of trees in the Dallas area. We have changed the microclimate, and we didn't have concrete everywhere, which warms the microclimate. So regionally, we affect climate, but globally, it's not clear to me we are causing warming. The other thing we disagree on is whether a modest warming is bad for mankind or humankind or the environment itself. What we know from history is that warmer periods have been better for human flourishing and civilizations than colder periods. The Vikings didn't settle supposedly permanent settlements in Greenland during a cold period. They settled during a warmer period when it was much warm, when it was as warmer than today, and Viking settlements expanded even into North America. And then guess what? We had a little ice age, and the Vikings abandoned their permanent settlements and moved back to Norway, Sweden, and the other Scandinavian countries.
And, you mentioned about the climate changing. In reading about Chinese history, there was a migration of people from the northwest of China to the central part, in part because as I understand it, over a couple of thousand years, drought started entering in. The growing seasons that they had were changing, and so people began to migrate to other places. Again, that would have been a few thousand years ago, had nothing to do with human interaction. It was just the climate changing in the various aspects of the land there, and that happens in the U.S. as well.
And how was it changing at the time? They abandoned those areas because it was getting colder. Crops don't do as well in cold weather. When you have frost nights, it kills crops. When you have water freezing over, it's not good for farming. And the Chinese were built upon dams and irrigation agriculture.
Right.
They were the first society that really adopted irrigation agriculture. So it didn't happen during a warming period. It happened during a cooling period. In fact, you can go back and see drawings. We didn't have photographs 300 years ago. You can go back and see drawings of Swiss villages about to be scraped away as the glaciers expanded and no one thought that was a good thing. And when they started declining at the end of the Little Ice Age in the middle 1800s, 1850s or so, everyone's cheering. Now they're declining and everyone's saying, oh, it's a disaster.
We're going to take a break here. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion with Dr. Sterling Burnett about environment, climate change, the Green New Deal, and what all that means for us in the public policy realm. So stay with us, and we'll be back in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
What does it mean to be an American citizen? Although that sounds like an essay question for middle school students, it is also a question that may be answered in the next presidential election. Most of the Democratic presidential candidates have a different definition of American citizenship than previous presidents. Let's start with some basic facts. In order to become a naturalized citizen of the U.S., you must demonstrate English proficiency and pass a citizenship exam. Most Americans believe that having some ability to read and write English was important, and having some civics knowledge would help future citizens appreciate America and its history. But a number of candidates, like Bernie Sanders and Beto O'Rourke, want to completely eliminate the U.S. citizenship exam. What about people from other countries who cross our border without permission or overstay their visas? Should that action be considered a crime? A majority of candidates, such as Cory Booker, Julian Castro, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren, don't think it should be a crime. Most of them believe that they should be allowed to stay in this country and have a pathway to citizenship, but as I just mentioned, they may not even require English proficiency or a basic knowledge of America. How would we know who is here illegally? You could use E-Verify, but many of the candidates that I just mentioned, along with Bill de Blasio and Kirsten Gillibrand, want to prevent the federal government from using E-Verify. You could ask the people if they are U.S. citizens on the census. Bernie Sanders said that would be absolutely bigoted language. John Hickenlooper said the question is corrupt and illegal. Never mind, the Supreme Court just ruled that the census cannot even have a citizenship question. As those last few comments illustrate, you really aren't even allowed to ask the question about what it means to be an American citizen. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, and sitting in the studio with me today, Dr. Sterling Burnett of the Heartland Institute, and we are talking about the environment. So we've talked a little about the heating and the warming of the earth. Let's talk about the oceans now, because the other thing we hear from the various climate models is we're all going to drown. There seems to be this notion that the water is going to be increasing, and it has been increasing slightly over thousands of years, apparently. But many of the climate models seem to predict that there's going to be a rapid increase in that, and we're going to lose Florida in the midst of this. So what's happening with the oceans rising?
Well, let's be clear. They haven't risen modestly over the last 12,000 years since the end of the last ice age. They've risen 400 feet. That's pretty substantial. They've risen and fallen because at one time they're now looking at Greenland, and they found out that, gosh, sea levels in Greenland at least were higher about 4,000 years ago than they are today. Mm-hmm. So they started to decline. Well, that doesn't surprise me because you had a little ice age and glaciers started growing, and the snowfall fell and came out of the oceans. What it shows is oceans rise between ice ages. So they've gone back and looked, and it turns out oceans were higher in the last interglacial. So between the last two ice ages, oceans are higher than they are now. I suspect until the next ice age comes, and I hope that's
a long way off.
Yeah, thousands of years in the future, oceans will continue to rise because that's what they do between ice ages as ice slowly melts. But the question is, are humans contributing to higher than average ice age? That's the claim. Mm-hmm. Climate models project, these models that haven't been proven valid on anything they predicted so far, they predict that, Greenland is going to completely melt off, which if that happened, it would raise ocean levels quite a bit. That Antarctica will decline. If that happens, it would raise ocean levels quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
If only they had some data to back it up, because what it turns out is we've got data, better or worse data. In some locations it's better than worse. We show that oceans aren't rising more rapidly on average around the globe than they have over the past 4,000 years. They're rising about 7 inches on average a century, which is what they rose in the past century, which they rose in the century before that, which, by the way, no one was claiming humans were causing global warming then. Now, in some places, like Florida, like Miami, for instance, they're having increased flooding.
Mm-hmm.
Is that because the seas are rising? No, it's because they built on swamps.
Yes.
They developed places that normally held water and absorbed water. They've created all this concrete. They have drained their aquifers. And so they have huge amounts of land subsidence. And where you find that, it turns out they say sea levels are rising. No, your land is subsiding. So they're getting hit hard. There's no question. And there are ways to fix that, but cutting carbon dioxide emissions will do nothing to prevent that.
You mentioned glaciers a minute ago, and I noticed a couple of weeks ago that there's a few glaciers that are actually growing apparently now.
Antarctica throws a wrench into all, even Greenland. Some of the glaciers in Greenland are glowing. Mm-hmm. Some other glaciers are growing. In fact, just last year, under the Obama administration previously, Glacier National Park put up signs saying all the glaciers will be gone by 2020.
I saw that.
They had the signs at all the visitor center. In the middle of the night last year, they quietly removed all those signs because the glaciers there started growing, contrary to all the climate models. In Antarctica, throws a monkey wrench into everything. Antarctica is adding tens of thousands of tons of ice every year. Now, you hear about West Antarctica and some glaciers breaking off.
Mm-hmm.
Completely true. Now, most of them are ocean floating glaciers. So they don't raise sea levels one bit.
Right, because they float.
They're already on the ocean.
Yeah.
They don't displace any water. But where they do have melting in Antarctica, it's due to underground volcanic activity. It's melting the ice from below, and so the ice is sliding off into the sea.
Mm-hmm.
Where that's not occurring, and that's most of Antarctica, it's actually adding ice. It's taking water out of the ocean, reducing sea level rise. None of the climate models project that.
Now, you mentioned the water rising in the climate models. You and I published a piece in the Epoch Times here recently, and for our listeners, that a link to that is on the website, pointofview.net. You can find that piece, and we discussed the climate models because a climate writer for the New York Times here a month or so ago had a piece in which she just accused President Trump of being a climate denier, doing rolling back everything the Obama administration had done because they were denying the predictions of the climate models. So let's let the listeners know we're not opposed to data. We like data. But what's driving most of this discussion is the climate models, where humans create a model that they make projections in, and just because just to be fair, there's some economic interest in them making claims that things are going to be worse than ever, because that's the ones the media carries. That's where you get the bigger grants. If you claim we're all going to die fairly soon, that's where they're able to raise more attention and more grant money. Talk a bit about the climate models.
More money has flowed into climate research in the last 15 years than flowed into climate research cumulatively in the 150 years before it. If tomorrow the so-called consensus came out and said, guess what, we were wrong, climate's not changing because of humans, we're not causing disaster, the vast majority of that money would dry up. So how likely is it, do you think they're likely to come to that conclusion? Concerning the climate models, any model, it's not just climate models, it's any model. It's called a model, it's not reality. And they're built on assumptions. Now, some of the basic things about climate models we can know. The physics, we understand physics. But most of the warming in climate models comes from what they call the feedback loops or mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So we know the Earth shuns, sunlight and cosmic rays come down. Some of it's reflected back. Greenhouse gases in the atmosphere trap some amount of that. We can estimate how much warming should occur as we thicken the greenhouse gas layer. But most of the warming doesn't come from just the thickening. It comes from what they call the feedback mechanisms. Will it release methane? Will it cause more or fewer clouds? What kind of clouds? And so they built in all these assumptions. That's where the climate models are just fiction. It's just guesstimates. There's no good evidence that these assumptions are right. And I would suggest that they're probably wrong, because when they do simple climate models, there are a few out there that don't have all the feedback mechanisms, that just do the physics. Mm-hmm. They're closer to the actual temperature rise. You only get alarm when you build in the feedback mechanisms. And so what the Trump administration did a few weeks ago that we wrote about is they said, you know what, econometric models. You talked about this to me, and you can discuss it better than me.
Economists use all kinds of models to try to project whether or not a budget increase, a tax increase, a budget cut, spending cuts, how that's going to affect the economy. So econometric models do try to do that. They're usually pretty bad at projecting that.
They're usually pretty bad at projecting that, and they're also usually pretty limited into how far out they make these projections.
Mm-hmm. Usually about 10 years or so.
Yeah, 10 years. What they don't do, I don't know of an econometric model that says we can predict from this tax change what will happen 100 years from now.
Which is exactly what the climate change
Which is what the climate change models do. They're always projected to go out to 2100 or beyond. And so in any model, if you get an error, if you get your assumptions wrong, the error grows over time. All the Trump administration did is recognize the fact that models are poor, maybe getting better, but they're poor reflectors of reality. And so we shouldn't trust their projections 100 years from now. We really shouldn't rely a lot in shaping policy on their projections 20 years from now. But they said we're going to project out 20 years rather than 100 years. That's destroying science. That was the claim in the New York Times, that he's undermining science because he wouldn't let flawed models. He wouldn't let our policy being driven by what flawed models say we're going to happen 100 years from now.
And he went out to 2040. So essentially, he allowed him to go for 20 years.
Yeah.
But it's I
mean, let's imagine. Just imagine, it's 1900, and our all-wise fathers in Washington D.C. said, "Okay, we got to decide how to live in 2000. What the world's going to look like." And set policy for what the world will look like in 2000 and 1900. We'd have been subsidizing hay for horses because everyone knew those internal combustion engines weren't going to make it. It was too expensive. Only the wealthy could have them. We still needed wagons and carriages. We would have been building more slums for immigrants in the inner city, even though just 50 years later, we're all spreading out, right?
That's Dr. Sterling Burnett, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to call and talk about climate change, 1-800-351-1212. Merrill Matthews will be back with Point of View in just a minute.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our teams stand strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
I'm Merrill Matthews. Welcome back to Point of View. I'm sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and with me in studio today, Dr. Sterling Burnett of the Heartland Institute. If you want to know more about Sterling, you can go to pointofview.net, and we have his bio up there and information about him and about the Heartland Institute. So we would encourage you to do that. Go to the Heartland Institute, look at their website. Lots of material up there available on a whole range of different issues. Sterling, tell me, because you cover environment for Heartland, but y'all do things on tax issues, health care,
we publish
tax and budget.
Yeah, we publish newspapers and research on budget and taxes, on health care, on education, on a wide variety of topics. Largely, if it's an economic issue confronting the United States, we cover it.
And you do a number of monthly papers on, you have the tax and budget, education reform, I think, health care. You do one on environment.
Our newspapers are budget and tax news, health care news, and environment and climate news. They go to every state legislator in the country, every head of an executive agency in the country, state, federal, all the federal legislators, and
if people want to sign up for that,
that wants to subscribe, and you can either subscribe and just get it online, or if you subscribe,
you're old school
with some money. Yeah, we still actually print these things. The legislators say they appreciate the print version, so we do it.
Yeah.
So I publish mine once a month, 10 times a year. We only publish 10 months a year. And then I also publish a weekly online-only a journal called Climate Change Weekly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's 3 weeks of the month. We don't release one the week that we release environment and climate news. Don't want to flood
so
people's
we would
inbox.
encourage you to do that. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to ask Sterling Burnett a question about environment. Let's start with let's turn now to the Green New Deal. Yep. So this is in a sense maybe sort of the culmination of all the focus that Democrats and the left have been putting on the climate. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a member of Congress from New York, came up with her Green New Deal. It was an interesting read when she first came out with it.
Yeah.
I think they've adjusted it just a little bit, but you had some pushback initially. But as I hear a number of Democrats, they're sort of essentially signing on to, if not the full Green New Deal, some light version of the Green New Deal. They're sort of all embracing it. What is the Green New Deal about?
Let's be clear. To be fair, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she's the biggest promoter of it. Mm-hmm. She's the popularizer of the Green New Deal, but it's been around for longer than her. It was around. Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii introduced a Green New Deal in the last Congress before Ocasio-Cortez entered Congress. I forget the New York Times writer that actually probably first broached the Green New Deal about a decade ago. So it's been around. Now she has added to it. I just want to say, when you consider the Green New Deal, you should also consider the people who are proposing it and whether we should take them seriously. Ocasio-Cortez recently opined that we need to get rid of daylight savings time. Why? Because if we just did that, the sun causes warming. And if we cut the number of daylight hours by getting rid of daylight savings time, we will have less warming and we can help save the earth. Apparently no one's ever informed her that, and no one should really have to inform her, that it doesn't matter how we change our clocks. The sun's going to shine on the surface of the earth the amount of time that it's going to shine, regardless of what we do with our clocks. But she's the one that's promoting it, and everyone's taking her seriously. And so what would it do? First off, let's be clear. It's not green. It's not new. And it's no deal for consumers and Americans. It's not green because it's actually going to harm the environment. Mm-hmm. It's promoting all sorts of things that would be bad for the environment. It's not new because the Communist Party has been promoting these things, and the socialists have been promoting these things for over 100 years. It's a complete government takeover of the economy. It's government directing how you live.
Because there's only a portion of that actually is focused on environment, because she has social justice issues in there. She has minimum wage issues. She has a whole range of things.
Living wage for everyone. Vacation, certain amount of paid vacation for everyone. Free college tuition. Free health care. Now, we all know free is not free. Somebody's paying for it, money, resources don't fall like manna from heaven to pay for these things. So someone's paying for it. All sorts of social things. But just on the energy side, let's talk about it. We're going to get rid of, we're going to stop emitting all carbon dioxide emissions, which means basically ending all fossil fuel use by 2030.
Right.
In 12 years, we're going to get rid of all the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure that's built up over the last 100 years. That's just, to me, that's sort of the smallest portion of it.
Well, you know, I actually did some number crunching on this because I think about 62%, 63%, something like that, of our electricity generation comes from fossil fuels. Only about 7.5% come from wind power and solar power. So just to replace, we've got about, if I remember right, 10,000, I think it's 10,000 wind turbines out there. But to replace what the fossil fuels now provide in terms of electricity generation, we were going to have to go up to something like 600,000.
We'd have to cover approximately a third of the continental United States with wind turbines and probably a quarter with solar panels. Because solar panels actually produce a little bit more energy than more efficiently. So, you know, if you like open land, if you like wildlife, if you like habitat, you got to hate the Green New Deal because it's going to take all of the open land, basically, and then you're going to have to string wires everywhere because the wind blows better in certain locations than other, and that's where you're going to build wind turbines. The sun shines better. You don't build a solar power plant in Maine or in Alaska or in areas.
Oregon or Washington.
They
have a lot of clouds.
Cloudy, rainy places.
But that also
and so you got to build wires everywhere. Your thousands and millions of more acres are taken up. And that's just for the power that we currently use. What about if we grow economically? What if we don't want to stay in stasis? Of course, that's what they're arguing for. Is we've got to live a steady state society. In fact, they want us to live simpler lifestyles, to go backwards. But, you know, as bad as that is, the estimates for the Green New Deal range from $50 trillion to almost $100 trillion. To put it in perspective, the $20 trillion approximately in debt that we built up over 250 years, it's 3 to 4 times that in 10 years. The biggest part of it, no one talks about this, but I think the biggest part of it is her claim that we've got to make sure every building in the United States is energy efficient. Every home, hundreds of millions of homes, apartments, businesses, all of them. Government agents are going to come into your home, your business, and say, your lighting's not efficient, you don't have good insulation, we've got to retrofit. In 10 years, we've got to change over every building. 250 years, 300 years of housing stock, because in the Northeast, you've got houses that were built in the 16th century, in the 1600s. All has to be changed. As I wrote at one time, I think you'd have to depopulate small countries in sub-Saharan Africa or south of the border to bring in the labor just to do that portion of the Green New Deal. Not to mention the rails you have to build because you got to get rid of cars. And so you got to have high-speed rail everywhere. There are not enough workers here in the United States to do the job. Now, maybe that's why they support open borders.
So, but people take it seriously. I mean, you don't have much real pushback in the media asking, is this even feasible? It's sort of almost assumed that this is a doable deal.
Yeah, no, look, you've got over 100 sponsors or promoters of the Green New Deal in Congress. Almost every Democrat senator who's running for the Democratic nomination for the presidency, Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, Cory Booker, Elizabeth Warren, to a lesser extent, Amy Klobuchar. Every one of them was a co-sponsor or supporter of the Green New Deal. Now, what's funny is Mitch McConnell, love him or hate him, he pulled one over on him. He brought it up for a vote in May.
Yes.
He said, "You really like this?
And they
you really think this is
criticized
a great idea?" And they criticized him. It's the first time I've ever seen where sponsors of a bill said, "Please don't bring a vote on our bill." What do you mean? And that's what he said. He says, "How can you not want to?" People beg for me to bring up bills for votes. They wait years and go through hearings before their bills are voted on. If they don't just die, I'm going to bring your bill up for a vote. And so the vote was held. Not a single person, including its sponsors, voted in favor of it. It was 56, I think, 3 or 4 Democrats, 57 nays voted against it. So some Democrats voted against it, 1 independent voted against it, and the rest of them were all present. They voted present rather than voting for their own bill. Crazy.
We'll be back with Dr. Sterling Burnett in just a minute.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. We're in our closing segment with Dr. Sterling Burnett of the Heartland Institute, and we're talking about the environment and the Green New Deal. And Sterling, the thing is that the U.S. has actually been doing a better job than most other countries in reducing our carbon dioxide output. I mean, the amazing thing is we are criticized. Trump was criticized for pulling us out of the Paris climate deal. Barack Obama made a deal with China, which is a coal factory powerhouse. Yeah. And yet we're criticized even though we've actually been improving that. What have we done here in terms of carbon dioxide emissions?
Yeah, look, I'm not afraid of carbon dioxide. It's a naturally occurring gas. It's called plant food. If plants don't have enough carbon dioxide, they die. That means we all die. It's not a pollutant. But if you're worried about carbon dioxide, if you are one of those people who thinks we're driving the world to doom because we're adding too much carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it turns out the U.S. is doing better than every other nation on Earth in reducing its carbon dioxide emissions, despite the fact that we don't have carbon dioxide taxes. We don't have regulations shutting down power plants. We don't have, we're not doing all the things they say we must do to save the Earth. Everybody else signed the Paris Climate Agreement. They're all missing their targets. We, who are out of the Paris Climate Agreement, are cutting emissions. We're getting no credit for it. Trump's getting bashed for pulling out of an agreement that no one else is keeping. China growing its emissions. It grew its emissions last year faster than it had grown the last 5 years. The world, emissions up. Europe, emissions up. And these are all the people that are complaining about our emissions. It's like, gosh, I can't imagine, let's say a movie star complaining that I fly to Washington, D.C. once a year on a jumbo jet crowded with people, not a commercial jet, and he flies across the nation 7 times in a year on a private jet and to private islands, and then he's complaining about my carbon dioxide emissions. That's what it's like.
Which actually goes on. Exactly.
His name is Leonardo DiCaprio. Yes. Let's name names. He gets climate awards, and then he flies on a private jet to an island to party with his friends. It's nice if you can get it.
So how have we been cutting our carbon emissions? And we've been transitioning to natural gas in part because of the fracking boom and the abundance of natural gas now.
Technology is a wonderful thing. And where you have markets, you have more technological innovation. Back in the early 2000s, natural gas prices were really high. I think they reached $14 per million BTU. Mm-hmm. And at the time I was interviewed, and they said, "Oh, the world's doomed. What do you think? Is this the new normal?" And I said, "Oh, no. Oh, gosh, no. Technology will work. We'll bring gas prices back to $8 or $9 per million BTU, I predict."
And you missed it.
Yeah, and I missed it by like a factor of 4. It's now at $2 and something per million BTU because no one, myself and even people in the industry at the time, didn't predict the fracking revolution. Mm-hmm. But some guys said, "Hold it. We can get access to gas that's just stored here and it's spread all around. We've got new technologies," and they came up with a way to produce copious amounts of natural gas, and now it's cheaper to build a new natural gas plant than a new coal-fired power plant.
And natural gas burns about half of the carbon, it releases about half the carbon dioxide as coal plants, I think, isn't it? A third?
I think it's a third. It emits a third. So we're reducing emissions through technological change, innovation, market solutions, not government mandates. Others who have all these mandates and restrictions and requirements are increasing their emissions. Europe doesn't allow fracking. They want to allow it. Some of them want to allow fracking, but they don't. China, as far as I can tell, they have no natural gas. I could be wrong about that. But if so, they haven't discovered it yet, because I guarantee you, if they had natural gas, they'd be fracking. So we used to be a natural gas importer, and the expectations were we had 40 to 60 years of natural gas left. We now have more than 100 years of natural gas, and we are a natural gas exporter. When I was first working on this issue, we were talking about building import terminals. Now we're building export terminals.
We're the largest producer of natural gas out there, and we're selling to others, helping them reduce their carbon emissions. Yeah. So it's an amazing.
Their reliance on Russia for natural gas in Europe.
Which is a key point, because many of the major fossil fuel producing countries, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, before the collapse, were not necessarily great friends of democracy and our allies in many things.
Not great friends of democracy and not great friends of, they were using their energy for geopolitical aims. Russia, every time Europe got into a conflict with Russia over human rights abuses or their invasion of Georgia or their invasion of Ukraine, Russia would cut off the taps, and suddenly you had blackouts in Europe.
In the middle of winter.
In the middle of winter. And so now we are helping Europe keep the power on, and they're still able to criticize Russia.
Take a minute to say, where are we going to go with this, with the Green New Deal? Are we actually going to try to pass something, you think, or do we really know too much that we're not going to do that?
Some fellow travelers and some Republicans, I think Republicans in name only, but Republicans have said, oh, yeah, we're worried about climate change too. And so they've offered their own versions of the Green New Deal light. So it's bad, but not as bad.
Republicans have done that in a lot of areas.
Yeah, we're going to tax you, but not as high as we would have taxed you before. We're going to restrict your energy use, but not as much as we would have done it before. We're going to fix more buildings, but not as many as we would have done before. We're not going to be quite as intrusive into your lives. I predict in the next election, those Republicans are going to have trouble. There'll be fewer of them, as there were in the last election, when those that supported climate change alarmism, many of them in marginal districts lost. So I don't think you're going to see anything. Certainly, we have Trump for the next 2 years, a year and a half, and nothing will pass while he's in power, and a lot will depend on who holds the House and the Senate in the next election.
Now, let's take our closing minutes here. You've got a climate change conference coming up, I believe.
Yeah, we do. It's the 13th International Climate Change Conference. It's being held in Washington, D.C. on July 25th. You can still, I say, if you want to know about climate, you've got to be there or be uninformed, because there is one of the few places, and some of our publications of the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, are the only places you'll find the other side of the argument for climate change.
And y'all have been doing this for years, right?
Well, it's the 13th annual. It's not an annual. It is the 13th conference, but they've been doing it probably since 2008, I think, was the first conference. So going on 11 years, we've had 13 conferences, plus we had 2 energy conferences, not specifically related to climate change. And we have scientists, the peer-reviewed climate scientists. The youngest, we're going to give an award this year to a prominent climate skeptic, a guy named Richard Lindzen, for speaking truth to power, for standing up for climate science. This is a guy who was, at the time, the youngest person ever to be inducted into the National Academy of Sciences. He's a climate skeptic. We have Roy Spencer, who for years ran NASA satellites. He developed and ran NASA satellites along with his colleague, John Christie. He's going to be at our climate conference. Former state climatologists for Delaware and Virginia are going to be at our climate conference. These are scientists. They know what they're talking about. They're not media mavens. They're not talking heads. They publish. They win awards. They're skeptics.
And they can find more out about that at heartland.org?
They can. Heartland.org. Go sign up for the conference. Fly in. It's at the Trump Hotel, and we'd love to have you there.
Well, Dr. Sterling Burnett, thank you for joining us for this hour to discuss all these issues, because there's few things that are sort of driving the media as much as the climate change issue. When we come back, we're going to be talking about Islam, a number of issues regarding that. We're going to do that. It's going to be a major program. So stay with us. And this is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson. Stay with us, and we'll be back in just a few minutes.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson. And with me in studio today, Charles Stolfus. He's Associate Pastor at Denton Bible Church. And Charles, I've been looking forward to this because we're going to have a program that I think people, the listeners out there, are going to find just fascinating.
Absolutely.
With us on the line is Al Fadi. Al is a former Muslim who was converted to Christianity and has become just very ingrained in the Christian mission and spreading the issue of Christ to the Muslim world and the challenges that Muslims face out there. So let's go to the phones and see if Al is with us. Al, are you with us?
Yes, sir, I am. Thank you so much for this invitation.
Thank you for joining us. I'm just really looking forward to this. Charles and I were talking about this before we went on the air. You've got a background in Islam, and so let's instead of just doing an introduction of you, let's let you take the time to sort of introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background, your past, your conversion to Christianity, and just how that all worked out.
Absolutely. I'll be happy to do so. Of course, Charles knows me, and I am so thankful for this wonderful opportunity to be with both of you. I am from Saudi Arabia originally. That's where I was born and raised. In fact, I spent most of my life, early life, on the western coast of Saudi in Jeddah. That's the town where I basically came from. And I grew up in an Islamic family. And as everybody knows, Saudi Arabia is the hub for Islam. In fact, that's where Islam originated from back in the 7th century. And I happen to be living about maybe 45-minute to an hour drive from Mecca, the town that Muslims face daily in prayers and also long to visit all the time, but specifically once a year during the pilgrimage. So needless to say, that the whole environment and the setting over there was Islamic, and Saudi Arabia is, in my view, I think it's the only country in the world that does not allow its citizen to practice any other religion. So you are a Muslim. The moment you're born as a Saudi, you're Muslim, and that's your identity. And never that I doubted basically Islam. I've always believed that Islam is God's final religion to mankind, that it was the final religion sent by the final messenger through a final message known as the Quran, and therefore practicing Islam was just a second nature to me. And unlike many times you'll meet Muslims who are traditionally Muslims, that's their identity, but you'll notice that they vary in their dogma, if you wish, or their devotion, but at the end of the day, they will not denounce basically their identity as Muslims, but some become more and more devout, and you can say I was one of those. As I continued to grow up and learn also about the faith, I became more and more devoted to Islam and its teachings, and I remember in my teen years, I began to get even fascinated by the idea that as a martyr in a holy war, I will have a guaranteed assurance of making it to the highest level of heaven that the Quran calls it as paradise. And the reason why I say this, because Islam is a religion of works, and it never ever gives you any assurance of your salvation unless if you're engaged in a holy war against the enemies of Allah and you die as a martyr, only then that your sins are forgiven, that you are taken straight to the highest level of heaven, and there'll be no judgment whatsoever. It's almost like the gospel in reverse, except you shed your blood versus Christ shedding his blood for you. So that was really my understanding, and that was back in the 70s, and nothing was going on in the Islamic world that will justify a holy war as we are seeing today, of course, until 1979, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, among many other things that were taking place geopolitically at that time, like the Iranian Revolution, for instance, and a couple of other events. Nevertheless, many young men from the entire Arab world and the Islamic world began to go to Afghanistan to join together and form what was called back then the Mujahideen, or the Fighters for God, which, by the way, one of those people was Osama bin Laden, who left Saudi among many others and took many Saudis with him by the blessing and the support, by the way, of the Saudi government and many other global powers, including the U.S., because it was perceived as a war against communism as well. Nevertheless, I, as a Muslim, thought that this would be my golden opportunity to go and fight and die and sacrifice my life. Because I was still a teenager, I came across a number of teachings by the Prophet of Islam where you need to get permission from your parents. So I went and kind of like sought to seek that permission. I didn't tell my parents I wanted to go and die, which really that was my hope. But I told them I want to go and earn good deeds for doing something like this. It's my duty to defend our brothers in the faith and so on and so forth. But my mother can smell blood. She kind of forbade me from doing this, and I didn't really want to take any risk and go secretly behind her back and end up dying. And I said, what if God rejects my work and tells me that I disobeyed my parents and my mother, which, by the way, I know it may come as a surprise to you and to your listeners. I know many times people think Islam denigrates women, but when it comes to the status of mothers, their status are really high, so that's why I was a little concerned about disobeying her. Stayed behind, finished my high school, went to an Islamic school actually in Mecca, a university over there, studied for a year and a half. My goal was to specialize in Sharia law, and then I changed my mind myself, and I came back to Jeddah, and I went to the local university over there, get a degree in engineering, and it was only then that I was encouraged by my father and my parents in general to seek a graduate degree in the West, preferably in the U.S., and that's what happened. I got accepted at one of the universities in the U.S., and I came over, and that was the first time ever I have left Saudi, and also first time for me to be in the West. Now, as a Muslim, many Muslims, if not even all Muslims, assume that the entire West is predominantly Christian with some Jews in there, and the belief is that you are born Christian. In other words, you inherit a religion called Christianity, just like Muslims inherit a religion called Islam. So that was my impression. I came to the U.S. thinking the U.S. as a nation is a Christian nation predominantly. Never ever that I heard of a born-again believers, never understood the gospel, the true gospel. I only understood what Islam taught me, and that the fact that the Bible is corrupt, the crucifixion of Christ never happened, Jesus is not God incarnate, nor the Son of God, and that's blasphemy if you consider him as such. So I came here thinking that that's what people are going to tell me, and I already know that it's wrong.
Al, we're going to take a break here. When we come back from the break, I want you to tell a little bit about your conversion and how that happened, and then we'll go into a little bit of the background on Islam. So our guest is Al Fadi talking about Islam. This is Merrill Matthews, A Point of View. Stay with us, and we'll be back in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
What does it mean to be an American citizen? Although that sounds like an essay question for middle school students, it is also a question that may be answered in the next presidential election. Most of the Democratic presidential candidates have a different definition of American citizenship than previous presidents. Let's start with some basic facts. In order to become a naturalized citizen of the U.S., you must demonstrate English proficiency and pass a citizenship exam. Most Americans believe that having some ability to read and write English was important, and having some civics knowledge would help future citizens appreciate America and its history. But a number of candidates like Bernie Sanders and Beto O'Rourke want to completely eliminate the U.S. citizenship exam. What about people from other countries who cross our border without permission or overstay their visas? Should that action be considered a crime? A majority of candidates, such as Cory Booker, Julian Castro, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren, don't think it should be a crime. Most of them believe that they should be allowed to stay in this country and have a pathway to citizenship, but as I just mentioned, they may not even require English proficiency or a basic knowledge of America. How would we know who is here illegally? You could use E-Verify, but many of the candidates that I just mentioned, along with Bill de Blasio and Kirsten Gillibrand, want to prevent the federal government from using E-Verify. You could ask the people if they're U.S. citizens on the census. Bernie Sanders said that would be absolutely bigoted language. John Hickenlooper said the question is corrupt and illegal. Never mind, the Supreme Court just ruled that the census cannot even have a citizenship question. As those last few comments illustrate, you really aren't even allowed to ask the question about what it means to be an American citizen. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. This is Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and with me in studio, Charles Stolfus, Associate Pastor of Denton Bible Church. And on the line, we have Al Fadi. He runs an organization, Sira International, which is an outreach to Muslims, and he's talking a bit about his conversion. And Al, let's go back to you brought us up to the point where you came to the U.S. and this is your first time to come to a country that has widespread Christianity because you were born and raised in Saudi Arabia. So tell us a little bit about your experience in the U.S. and how you came to Christ.
Absolutely. When I came to the U.S., as you stated correctly, my understanding that everybody was Christian, so I had no desire whatsoever basically to question Islam. In fact, I have every motive to invite people to accept Islam. But the Lord was so gracious that the first encounter with born-again Christians happened when I needed help with English idioms, and the university recommended one of the organizations on the campus where I ended up meeting a born-again believing family for the first time. And God used that family to plant the seed of salvation for the first time in my life, even though I didn't fully understand the gospel as they shared it. However, years later, I began to reflect back on what was shared with me as I developed more and more understanding of the gospel. So the seed was planted. I ended up shifting campuses. I met more born-again believers, and I started to understand that there is freedom of religion in the U.S., and therefore everything I learned about the U.S. was wrong. Now, I'm still not doubting Islam, but the more I hear about born again and differences between what I thought the gospel is versus what the actual gospel message is, God was so gracious and so patient with me that he surrounded me by godly men, women, families, and slowly and gradually more seeds were planted. until the year 2001, when I decided, it was almost 12 years basically span, that I decided for the first time to attend church, again for ulterior motive. I wanted to attend church thinking that maybe I can learn a little bit more about Christianity the way it's described to me, and I'll be more effective to convert Christians to Islam. And when I attended church, it was in May of 2001, and it wasn't until September 11 happened, because they've been preaching the gospel from the Gospel of John all this time. But when September 11 happened, I went and I heard a message about loving your enemies. And I can tell you, brother, that that's when the nail that sealed the coffin in my conversion happened, and I accepted Christ as Lord and Savior in November of 2001.
Tell us a little bit about your ministry, too.
After I accepted Christ, my ministry took off just in a very slow motion. It was just a weekend ministry, sharing my testimony, and slowly and gradually, my church first started to ask me to teach about Islam so that people know how to love on Muslims and share the gospel with them. But slowly and gradually also, I felt the need for discipleship, and I started to do discipleship in a variety of formats, one-on-one, in Bible study groups, and then one of the local seminaries was doing classes at the church itself during Sunday schools and things like that. I started to get fascinated by really the idea of going to seminary, and indeed that's what happened. It was in 2008 that I went to seminary, and I studied under authorities like Dr. Wayne Grudem and others, and it was a huge blessing in my life for sure. But it wasn't until 2010. I've been an engineer, by the way, all of these years. Since I graduated in the U.S. until 2010, I've been practicing engineering and weekend ministry. But in 2010, because of the dire state of the economy at that time, I lost my job, and it was indeed a sign for me that God is calling me for full-time ministry, at least a confirmation, because I've been told about this many times by different people, but it was a final confirmation. And ever since, I've been a full-time missionary. We founded this ministry called CIRA, which stands for the word, by the way, Center for Islamic Research and Awareness. But the acronym CIRA is an Islamic acronym. A Muslim, when they hear the word CIRA, they think I'm teaching about Islam or the history of Islam. And it was intentional. We wanted to look benign. We don't want people to be offended by the name. So that's how we launched it. CIRA is really about teaching, equipping, and training the church, but also it's about evangelizing the Muslims and discipling the believers as well. And I do it in a variety of ways. One way is in person. That's when I ended up meeting Pastor Charles. And also I do it via webinars online. And the second part of my approach is media. We use media a lot. I have a YouTube channel under the same name, CIRA International. We have a website present under CIRAInternational.com. And we use also radio. I have my own podcast called Let Us Reason with Fadi. And we've been seeing really a lot of wonderful fruit coming out of this. It's reaching globally. There is a lot of hunger out there. And I do my ministry, by the way, in both languages, in Arabic and in English. And sometimes I get asked, why am I doing it in English when, in fact, I'm an Arab from Saudi? I do it in English, dressed up in my Saudi dress, as will people see me on my YouTube channel, because I have a heart for the majority of Muslims in the world that do not speak Arabic. You'll be surprised to know that only out of the 1.6 billion Muslims, about 300 million speak Arabic. The rest do not speak Arabic. So someone has to reach out to them, and I feel like the Lord has prepared me for a mission like this.
Well, Al, this is Charles Stolfus. First of all, it's good to hear from you and speak with you. I think I met you several years ago when I invited you to speak at our church, and it was a wonderful series of seminars you did. So it's great to just reestablish our contact here. You mentioned that Islam was founded in the 7th century. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about the founding of Islam in the 7th century, and maybe just a brief sketch of Muhammad's life and just the series of incidents that led to the establishment of this religion of Islam?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good to hear from you, brother. Muhammad, of course, is the name associated with the founding prophet of Islam. He was born supposedly in the year 570 AD, and it wasn't until he was at the age of 40 in 610 AD when he claimed to have received his first revelation. Now, before that, Muhammad really grew up in a paganistic society in Mecca from the tribe the tribe of Quraysh. And there is evidence even from the Quran that he himself practiced idolatry and even bowed down to idols. But all that to say that supposedly Muhammad struggled at the social level. His father died right before his birth, and his mother died when he was 6 years of age. Then his grandfather, who was the head of the tribe, took care of him for 2 more years, and he also passed away at age when he was 8 years old. And then his uncle, the father of his cousin Ali, who is very important because the Shia branch of Islam is associated with his cousin Ali. So you can see already the tension that is happening here. Nevertheless, it wasn't until age 25 when Muhammad married a woman by the name of Khadija. She was a widower, and many believe that she was also a practicing Christian, but not the Christianity that you and I know it. It's a branch known as Ebionites, which they have some emphasis on the Jewish law. They denied the Trinity. They denied the sonship of Christ and things of that nature. And when Muhammad was at the age of 40, he claimed to have been meditating in a cave, and he's been doing this supposedly for many years, seeking truth. And in that encounter, an angel, whom he later, 14 years later, identified as the angel Gabriel, supposedly appeared to him and revealed to him the first revelation in the Quran, which is found in chapter 96 of the Quran, verses 1 to 3. And it's an interesting thing because that first encounter, supposedly the angel squeezed him and asked him to read a scroll, when in fact, according to the Islamic traditions, Muhammad was an illiterate person. So I really don't know why God would choose an illiterate person and ask him to read. Nevertheless, that's the encounter. And for 23 years after that encounter, from 610 until 632, Muhammad have claimed to be the prophet, not just to the Arabs, but also to all mankind. And he revealed what we know today as the Quran over the span of those 23 years. And the message that he brought with him is what we call Islam.
Now, following his death, there would be a need for a successor, I presume. And can you tell us a little bit about what happened after his death? I think it maybe relates to the Sunni-Shia split that has happened.
Absolutely. You know, in Arab tribes and even in many other tribes, and even till this day, I mean, you'll see the same thing at the royal families in the Arabian Peninsula in all these countries, that the power is passed on from the father to the son usually, or from the father to another member of the family. And what happened is when Muhammad died, and he was technically speaking the head of the state of Islam.
Al, let me get you to hold it there because we're going to take a quick break here. We've got a break coming up. So when we come back, Al Fadi's going to talk a little bit more about how the descendants of Islam carried on and what happened after that. I'm Merrill Matthews with Point of View, and we'll be back in just a minute.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. This is Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson. In the studio with me, Charles Stolfus, Associate Pastor at Denton Bible Church, and on the line, Al Fadi, who runs Syria International and which is an outreach to Muslims. And Al has been going through both his conversion and what's happening, and now we're sort of going into the history of Islam a little bit. So Al, as we were coming up to the break, you've got Muhammad dies in 632, I believe it is, but he doesn't have a successor, and somehow or other we've got to move. They hadn't set that process up. What happens after that?
Exactly. When he died, of course, as I said, as it was the custom of those days and continues to be the custom of these days, that his relatives rushed to say, listen, he doesn't have any sons, and therefore we need to really find someone, a family member. And Ali, his cousin, would have been the closest to fill that role, simply because he grew up with Ali, so Ali was like a brother to him. He's literally his cousin. And Ali was married to Muhammad's only surviving daughter, so he is his son-in-law and the father of Muhammad's two surviving grandsons. So therefore, Ali would have qualified. But the majority of Muhammad's followers, known as the Sahaba or the companions, overruled the tradition and elected one of their own, the closest friend to Muhammad, by the name Abu Bakr, and he became the first caliph. Then came the second closest friend to Muhammad by the name Omar, and then thirdly came one of Muhammad's son-in-laws, his name was Uthman. It wasn't until later, almost over 20 plus years, that Ali, the cousin, became the fourth caliph. All that to say, that created immediately a division and friction within the fresh community, the small community of Islam. And that continued to carry on until today, represented by the clash between the Shia who follow Ali, represented by Iran, and the Sunnis who followed the tradition of the companions, known as protected by Saudi. So you can see the friction till this day over the last 14 centuries. And sometimes I really shake my head when I hear that people want to try to find a solution to this tension.
They haven't found one in 14 centuries. Now, the Sunni, that's roughly, was it 80% of the Muslim population?
Give or take, between 80 to 85%, but they are the majority. I mean, technically speaking, you meet any Muslim, you can use a rule of thumb that the chances are this is a Sunni. After that, there is the Shia. If they come from Iran, almost 99% of the time that they will be Shia, or at least from a Shia background. But then there's few minority groups that are considered by the Sunnis and the Shia to be heretical groups as well.
Now, the expansion of Islam started shortly after Muhammad died, during those four caliphs. Talk a little bit about the expansion.
Absolutely. Every caliph out of these four made it a mission to spread Islam. So the first caliph, Abu Bakr, kind of like finished whatever parts of the Arabian Peninsula itself that were lacking Islam. And then Omar is the one who began to spread it north, focused primarily on Egypt, parts of modern-day Syria and Jerusalem, and also parts of North Africa. And then came the third one, who expanded it beyond that, reaching all the way territories like, for instance, modern-day Turkey, all the way to what we call Afghanistan, and even the majority of North Africa, all the way later on, continuation of this after the fall of the four caliphs called the righteous caliphs. After the end of their era, a new dynasty rose called the Umayyad dynasty, also cousins with Muhammad. They're the one who carried it throughout North Africa all the way to most of Spain, and they called that region Andalusia. And since then, Islam had what we know today as the Golden Age. It started to reach its strength and rising for a little over, at least, one can argue about 500 to 600 years, until its decline around 1254. And from there, we had a quick break And then came another dynasty that lasted for another 500 years. That's the Ottoman Empire, and whereby the last known Islamic caliphate. And therefore, in 1924, at the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire represented the last surviving Islamic caliphate collapsed. And since then, people are seeing many attempts, sometimes in a peaceful way and sometimes in a violent way like ISIS, to reestablish those caliphates. But everything that was done, I can assure people, was done by the sword, by intimidation, by threatening, and by taking over territories.
It's amazing because I don't think the average person realizes just how aggressive that expansion was. I mean, within 20 or 30 years after Muhammad died, they had conquered much of the Middle East, had moved into North Africa, were getting ready to move into Spain. It was a phenomenal conquest, and yet, including Jerusalem. But if you were just an average looker on, you might very well think this is being backed by God because they are so successful in that conquest.
Absolutely. And, Merrill, what's so interesting, by the way, that the ISIS phenomenon is almost like a micro representation of what happened back then. The environment was very ripe when the expansion of early Islam happened. What I mean by that is you have the Byzantine Empire, you have the Western Roman Empire, and they were clashing with each other. And then on top of that, you have what we call the Persian Empire, represented by Iran today, also clashing with them. So the geopolitical arena was weakened. The church was cracking down on its own. There is a lot of excommunication, things like that. So traditional Christians from within were also tired of their own religion. So it was ripe, basically, where people began to support the Islamic conquest, thinking that this is kind of like a sign from God, by the way. And some of them thought even this is the end times, and therefore they thought like they were doing God a favor by expediting this. So all that to say, the same thing happened when ISIS came into the scene. The geopolitical arena was divided. There was a lot of battles taking place between different branches and countries and political parties, and people of ISIS thought God was on their side. Look, we took swaths of territories from Iraq and Syria, and therefore it must be God's timing for us to reestablish the caliphate.
Now, Al, when we consider the teachings of Islam, we would think of something like the worldview of Islam. Can you give us a sense of what that perspective on reality is, their understanding of God and morals and just the whole perspective on the world, maybe distinguish it from Christianity?
Absolutely. I mean, in a nutshell, Muslims do believe there is a God who is a creator of heaven and earth. His name is Allah. And they claim that he is the same God of the Bible. In fact, they will point you to the Arabic Bible and say the Arabic Bible uses the name Allah as a generic name for God, which is, by the way, doesn't mean anything. Nevertheless, the name Allah existed even before the rise of Islam among pagans themselves, because the father of Muhammad, who wasn't a Muslim, was only a pagan, an idolater, his name was Abdullah, servant of Allah. So we know Allah would have been a name of one of the main idols, possibly. Nevertheless, they believe in a God who's a creator. They believe that God made all of humanity, including Jesus. So that's where we start to differ. Jesus was just a prophet. Jesus was a human being. Jesus was created by Allah like anybody else. This God also is the judge. And one day he's going to judge everybody, including judging Jesus. And at the same time, when it comes to practicing on a daily basis, Muslims have certain rituals. What makes a Muslim Muslim is that what we call the pillars of Islam. You have to confess a specific creed that there is no God but Allah, and there is no prophet or a final prophet who is Muhammad. If you do this, you're a Muslim automatically. Now you have to do other things to begin to accumulate good deeds, because Islam is a religion of works. You have to pray 5 times at least daily. You have to fast a month called Ramadan and beyond if you want to. You have to perform a pilgrimage. You have to give charity, but you give it only to Islamic causes. You don't give it outside of that. And as a result of all of this, you become basically a Muslim. You accumulate good deeds and bad deeds, and you'll be judged in accordance to that. Muslims also believe Sharia law is essential. That's why you see push for Sharia everywhere Islamic communities emerges, because they feel Sharia law is the identity of our community, and if we live under Sharia law, then we're fulfilling our role as Muslims everywhere we go. And then, of course, there's many other things along the way when it comes to that.
1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you have a question about Islam, you're concerned about it, if you've had experiences with Islam, give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. Al-Fadi will be on the line for the rest of this segment and for the next hour, so we've got time for it. If you want to know more about Al, go to pointofview.net. We've got his bio up there. We have links to his information, and we also have a link to his organization, Sira International, and you can find out more about that. So stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute and with more of our interview with Al Fadi.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We're back. Merrill Matthews in for Kirby Anderson, and we've got on the line Al Fadi as he talks about the issues facing Islam, what's behind Islam, and their thinking. So, Al, we finished up. Go ahead and continue with your thoughts there.
Basically, we're talking about the Islamic worldview. I talked about the need for Sharia law to establish a true and pure Islamic community. Other views that Islam has to do with also the concept of death. Muslims believe that people live three different lives, believe it or not. You live on earth, you die. There is a life, an intermediate life in the grave where some people will be punished, some people will be actually pampered, if you wish. and then finally Judgment Day, where that's when you get your final verdict, whether you're going straight to heaven or you go to hell. But even hell, in the mind of a Muslim, is not eternal. You can be rescued from the hellfire at some point. So that makes really evangelism among Muslims a little bit complicated. Not to mention, of course, the rejection of the idea that someone can die for my own sin. They will tell you flat out loud, and they'll be honest with you that, hey, I sinned, I should pay for my own sin. Why should someone else, and especially the prophet Jesus, as I stated earlier, he's a prophet only in their mind, why should he suffer for my sin? So these are some of the primary, basically, worldviews that distinguishes Islam from Christianity.
You had mentioned Sharia law earlier. There's been some concern that that there's a movement to try to impose Sharia law in parts of the United States. What are your thinkings about that?
Well, you know, it's really a tough issue here. I mean, I have to walk a fine line because I know I'm going to make some people upset by what I'm going to say, and also I'm going to make some other people excited about what I'm going to say. Nevertheless, Sharia law, as we know it, is not a monolithic system. Here's what I mean. The Sunnis have their own way of interpreting Sharia and its practice and its application, and the same thing, the Shia have their own. But here's the beauty about this. Under the Sunni, there is 4 different schools of Sharia. Under the Shia, there's 3 different schools of Sharia. So I haven't even scratched the surface to say there is tons of other interpretations. In other words, what I'm saying is you're not going to have a Sharia law that all Muslims are going to agree on, because in the West, they assimilate from a variety of backgrounds. But nevertheless, they're always going to push for the minimal, at least, application, like a family court for marriage, for divorce, for child care and support, for inheritance, and so on and so forth. But that's still dangerous, because in England, they approved that and allowed it, and now they have a little over 80 of them, and now they're regretting that because they're realizing there is a lot of abuse taking place, especially against women. I could have told them this a long time ago, but nobody would have listened.
1-800-351, well, go ahead.
Yeah, that's the kind of Sharia law that I'm saying, that we shouldn't worry, really, that it will take over the U.S.
1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to talk to Al, if you have a question or you want to share an experience that you've had with Islam. 1-800-351-1212.
Al, you've spoken of the teachings of Islam, and you've mentioned the Quran, Sharia law. Can you tell us just briefly, what is the Quran? What is the source of Sharia law? And are there any other holy books that really explain the teachings of Islam?
Yes, sir. So the Quran, in the mind of a Muslim, is the only holy book now that you have to go to. What I mean by that is, a Muslim will tell you, I'm sure Jesus brought a book that is holy called the Injil. I'm sure Moses brought a book called the Torah. I'm sure other prophets did the same, but those books either have been corrupted if they survived or no longer with us. But amazingly, the same God that brought these books somehow is going to protect the Quran now for all of eternity. Therefore, this is the book that you have to live by. And therefore, a Muslim is going to reject, of course, the Bible naturally because of these accusations against the Bible that it's been tampered with and so on and so forth. A Muslim also thinks the Quran is a perfectly preserved and a complete book. What I mean by complete is that whatever the Prophet of Islam shared with his people when he was alive 14 centuries ago was preserved first in memories, then in writing, and somehow in the last 14 centuries, we still have exactly the same revelation that was given to the Prophet. In other words, if you find any early manuscripts or intermediate manuscripts, they're going to match what you have in your hand today. I can tell you this, there's some bad news out there for my Muslim friends. That ain't the case, but we'll get to it later. Now, there is another source that Muslims consider to be holy. That's the saying of the Prophet himself, known as hadith. It's a collection of his own teachings that were saved by memory for over 240 years, and there was a chain of narrators and until finally someone decided that I'm going to write it down. And that's when the writing down of the hadith started. And then there's at least 6 what we call sanctioned collections under the Sunnis, and there is a couple of those under the Shia. It is these 2 sources, the Quran and the hadith, that are considered to be the primary sources for what we call Sharia law. But then there is also a third source that is secondary, which is the opinion of the teachers of the law. If the teacher of the law interprets something and there is a consensus among them, then that becomes basically the way to interpret it based on the traditional interpretation. But what if there isn't something that you can find in the Quran or in the Hadith? Somehow they will use something called analogy. So the teacher of the law will use another case that is mentioned in the Quran or the Hadith as an analogy, and they will reach their own conclusion based on that. So they become, technically speaking, the ones who are dictating what should and shouldn't happen, and this is another proof that the Islamic law is a man-made law.
I'll take about a minute or so to explain the relationship between the Bible and the Quran.
Well, the relationship is very simple. The Quran considers itself to be superior to the Bible. Muslims will say the Bible has been tampered with, therefore don't use it anymore. Come to the Quran because that's the full interpretation of everything that you need. However, sadly for our Muslim friends, the Quran, believe it or not, never ever accused the Bible of corruption. It accused some people of tampering with the interpretations and the meanings and things like that, but it never says a book called the Bible has been corrupted. The Quran actually quoted from the Bible. The Quran actually praised the people who are following the Bible. The Quran called the Bible actually the book of guidance, and the list can go on and on and on. Therefore, it is always important for us, if we're reaching out to Muslims, to understand these things and try to reason with them, of course, in a loving way, if they're open for that, of course. I mean, you can't force people to listen to the gospel or the truth, but you have to really challenge them and ask them, why do you think that the Bible is tampered with when your own book that you consider to be holy didn't say so? So size-wise, the Quran is almost the size of the New Testament, technically speaking. And the Quran also, unlike the Bible is a book that has narrative, a meta-narrative story. And if you start in Genesis, you end in Revelation, I don't care who you are, you get the idea. There is a meta-narrative, a storyline that you can understand, even though people end up skipping, of course, Leviticus. But that's a whole different ballgame, you know? So you'll keep reading, and you'll understand what's going on and why Jesus becomes important. Even if you reject him, you get a story. In the Quran, not so. It's really a cut and paste sections that sometimes it jumps from one story to the other, or from one story to all of a sudden to Allah or something like that. So you cannot really tell which is which when it comes to the Quran.
1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to talk to Al Fadi, 1-800-351-1212. Kirby Anderson, I'll also mention, has written a book, Understanding Islam and Terrorism, a Biblical Point of View, so I would direct your attention to that. If you'd like to know more about Al, we have his information and his organization up on our website, pointofview.net, so we'd encourage you to go there and take a look at that. We've got another hour with Al, so we've got some calls coming in, and we've got the lines open, so if you'd call, we ask those on the line to hold on for a minute for our break, and we'll be back. 1-800-351-1212 with Al Fadi on Islam. We'll be back in just a minute.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. This is Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson. With me in studio, Charles Stolfus, Associate Pastor at Denton Bible Church, and on the line, Al Fadi. And we're talking about Islam and Christianity. Al, we've got a caller on the line, 1-800-351-1212, if you'd like to call in. And let's go to Faye in Georgia. Faye, you're on the line.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for your program, and God bless you for converting to becoming a Christian. Yes, I have a sister that was raised Christian. She was baptized and even made a recommitment, but anyway, she married a Muslim, and she is converted to Islam, and they have a child that's 16, and of course they are bringing her up in Islam. They live in Canada now. They did live in the United States. My question, we have a relationship, but I have to have it quite, I guess, gingerly, you might say, but that I do get to talk to them and so forth and so on, but at times I have given her stuff, even little gifts with scripture on them, and she's turned them down or told me she can't have them. And she very much wants to know what's going on in the family. When I tell her about some needs, she's very quick to say, "We'll be praying for her." And I know in my heart that they're not praying to the same God. And I want to say so much more, but I just say thank you. And they're very quick. They love it when I say, "God bless you." They're accepted that they consider God, and they want to try to say that God and Allah are the same thing and that sort of thing. But anyway, please give me some insight. And I know I need to pray for them, and, I'm just devastated in thinking what lies ahead for them, and especially my sister and my niece.
Al, do you have any comments for Faye?
Well, Faye, I'm so sorry to hear this. This is, by the way, a common theme, especially when someone marries a Muslim. It's really a proof of the superiority of Islam in terms of it doesn't tolerate any presence of any other faith among its family in this case. All you can do, obviously, is prayer, and you need to gently keep sharing, whether scripture, share maybe video testimonies of former Muslims who accepted and embraced Christ now and born-again believers. You never know. Maybe she is eager to watch him privately or something like that, but you do your part until she shuts that door, and continue, of course, praying for others to appear to her and talk to her. Pray that Jesus himself will appear to her in a vision or a dream, but we cannot really convert people, but we can always share the truth with them in love and, hope for the best. That's all we can do, obviously.
Well, when she says, telling family members that I'm praying for them, I mean, should I just say thank you and go on, or,
Well, you can... that's a good question, Faye. You can try next time and say, when you say you pray, how do Muslims pray? I mean, you know how we pray, because obviously she came from background, so she knows when you say I'm praying for them. Do you guys pray in groups? Do you ask your husband to pray? How do you pray? Tell me. And which God do you pray to? Do you really believe the God of Islam is the God of the Bible? And if she said yes, to say, do you call him Father, for instance? Because we pray to the Father. Does he have a son who died for you? I mean, you need sometimes to be a little bit tough in sharing the truth. And, I understand, I get it. Her feelings might get hurt at that moment, but you're just sharing some truth, and you don't know that one day, by the way, she will reflect back on these things. Let me encourage you, the family that shared Christ with me for the first time, 12 years later, that resulted in me believing in Christ, but I couldn't find them for 10 more years. So 22 years have passed. They quit ministry because they thought it wasn't working. But they continued to pray for me for 22 years, by the way, because they told me when I connected with them
prayer warrior.
that they were praying for me.
That's great. Well, I will say this very quick because I know other people. I've been at several little family events, and it's been a while when they were living in Florida, and I wanted so much to say so much more because they complimented me because I was probably the only Gentile or Christian in the group, and more than one of the other family members would say something about. They just were saying things to let me know that they saw a difference in me, and I wanted to, and I didn't tell, and this has been years ago. This is probably 10 or 15 years ago. I didn't say yes, it's Jesus, but that made me feel, and I don't mean in a prideful way, but it made me feel good that they were seeing something different, if that makes sense. And
Amen.
You've encouraged me, and God bless you, and God bless your ministry, and God bless Point of View. And thank you for letting me and give me that information. And you've encouraged me to don't give up, keep praying, and I'm believing one day they're going to see the light of day.
Amen.
Thank you, Faye. And it does open a question, Al. How does a Muslim who's become a Christian, or how do you witness to Muslims, especially if you've been a Muslim? I guess that's helpful. But what's the best way to do that?
I don't want to sound like a pessimist, but those who embrace Islam, who come from a Christian background, become so dogmatic about Islam because they feel like they are the protectors of the faith now. And for some reason, of course, they believe in the lies that were told to them about the Bible, that it was corrupt. They get disappointed that we were worshiping three gods, and I didn't know that. No one was able to articulate the Trinity, so it must be true then that there is three gods, and that Jesus really never got crucified because that's what the Quran says, and so on and so forth. So it's really complicated. You want to really reason with them if they're willing to by sharing facts and truth, but at the end of the day, I found it from my own experience, they become very, very hard to reach. So prayer becomes the only way you can overcome that obstacle. But if they're open, of course, then you begin to reason with them about why do you think the Bible is corrupt? Where is the source that substantiates that? Why are you saying that Jesus wasn't crucified? Let's go through the evidence from within and from outside the Bible, and so on and so forth. So if they're open, then there is ample evidence and sources that you can share with them. But if not, they're not open, I'm afraid that we're left just with prayers.
1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to talk to Al Fadi about Islam, Christianity, the relation between the two. 1-800-351-1212. We have more information about Al on our website, pointofview.net. You can go there and click on the show, and you'll get information about Al, his background, his organization, Sira International, and what he is doing, and follow him and find out more about what he's doing there. So when we come back, we've got some calls coming in. We also want to ask Al about the eschatology of Islam. So we've got several calls coming in. Stay on the line. We'll be back with him in just a minute. 1-800-351-1212.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
What does it mean to be an American citizen? Although that sounds like an essay question for middle school students, it is also a question that may be answered in the next presidential election. Most of the Democratic presidential candidates have a different definition of American citizenship than previous presidents. Let's start with some basic facts. In order to become a naturalized citizen of the U.S., you must demonstrate English proficiency and pass a citizenship exam. Most Americans believe that having some ability to read and write English was important, and having some civics knowledge would help future citizens appreciate America and its history. But a number of candidates, like Bernie Sanders and Beto O'Rourke, want to completely eliminate the U.S. citizenship exam. What about people from other countries who cross our border without permission or overstay their visas? Should that action be considered a crime? A majority of candidates, such as Cory Booker, Julian Castro, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren, don't think it should be a crime. Most of them believe that they should be allowed to stay in this country and have a pathway to citizenship, but as I just mentioned, they may not even require English proficiency or a basic knowledge of America. How would we know who is here illegally? You could use E-Verify, but many of the candidates that I just mentioned, along with Bill de Blasio and Kirsten Gillibrand, want to prevent the federal government from using E-Verify. You could ask the people if they are U.S. citizens on the census. Bernie Sanders said that would be absolutely bigoted language. John Hickenlooper said the question is corrupt and illegal. Never mind, the Supreme Court just ruled that the census cannot even have a citizenship question. As those last few comments illustrate, you really aren't even allowed to ask the question about what it means to be an American citizen. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We're back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson. In the studio with me, Charles Stolfus, Associate Pastor at Denton Bible Church, and Al Fadi on the line with us. And Al, we've got a call from Dennis, who has a question for you. Dennis, you're on the air from South Carolina.
Okay, thank you for taking my call. It's kind of it's a question that depends on what you know, because I don't know. I heard Michael Youssef talking about a new book that he's just written. This was a few months ago. And he talked about something I think he called the third way, or the third wave. Muhammad being the first, the caliphate being the second, and this is the third way of taking over the world. And I just wonder what you know about that and how much credence you do give to that.
Excellent, Dennis. That's actually a good introduction to the segue into our issue of eschatology. So we'll turn it over to Al. Al?
Certainly, I won't be able to speak on behalf of Dr. Youssef. I did not attend his book yet, at least. I heard him talking about a new book, but I wasn't listening really to how he described it. But most likely he is talking about the fact that Islam now is compelled to try to bring a conclusion to life as we know it by continuing to push for the rise of the caliphate, because it's really necessary, because when it comes to end times, Islam teaches that, believe it or not, it borrows a lot of stuff from the writing of Paul and also Revelation in general. It talks about the earth will be filled with lawlessness and lack of faith, and as a result of this, God is going to send Jesus now as the sign of end times. And it is Jesus, or according to the Shia, the guided Mahdi, the guided one basically, or the so-called the 12th Imam, according to the 12ers, will come in to fight a so-called Antichrist who will try to take over the world, and therefore God now is coming to get rid of lawlessness and appoint either Jesus or the 12th Imam or both of them to be the rulers at the end times. And that's technically speaking what is taking place right now. You have Iran believes that an Armageddon must take place in order for the coming of the 12th Imam. You wonder why then Iran is pushing for war in the region. And the Sunnis, on the other hand, believe that something is going to take place. They're not really 100% like on the Shia side of things about an Armageddon, but nevertheless, because of the rise of lawlessness and departure from Islam and so on and so forth, God is going to send Jesus to fight this once and for all and reestablish the Islamic rule all over the earth for 40 years. Then the day of resurrection or judgment day will take place. Everything will be annihilated, and then a trumpet will be sounded, and all the dead will rise, including Jesus himself, and there'll be judgment according to the deeds of people. Some will be awarded heaven, some will be thrown in the hellfire, and even those in the hellfire could be rescued later.
The ISIS, the caliphate, they were trying to sort of implement the eschatology, were they not?
Absolutely. They thought it was a fulfillment of a tradition by the Prophet of Islam that in the end days that a minority group from the Islamic community will rise and they will be fought by many. And, you know, every time I used to hear on the radio that the coalition forces and they mounted up to 60-plus nations, I'm like, man, that's making the ISIS fighters get even more excited now.
Al, you speak of end times eschatology for Islam, and of course Christians have a very detailed eschatology also on what things lie ahead, and yet for Christians in the intervening time, we have a command from Jesus to take the gospel to the uttermost parts of the earth. We call that the Great Commission. Do Muslims have a similar kind of a command from Allah or from Muhammad or from the Quran to aggressively evangelize and fill the world with the religion of Islam?
Absolutely. So you have, I'm going to simplify it. I'm going to say there are two views on this. You have the majority Muslims, let's call them the peaceful Muslims, who believe that just by migrating and going to places just like I did to go and study first, you can continue to establish Islamic communities, build mosques, and invite people to know more about Islam, and in doing so, many people will convert. But then you have the minority radical wing of Islam, like the ISIS, for instance, who say, no way, we have a specific clear command in the Quran that we must fight until no other religion except the religion of Allah will become the dominant one. Therefore, we are already in a war between Muslims and non-Muslims. Non-Muslims despise Islam. They don't want us to have our Sharia law. They don't want us to expand, and therefore the only solution is the sword, if you wish, and therefore we have to continue to do this until Islam becomes supreme, and the God of Islam is the only God that is worshipped.
Al, what is the difference between the Christian view of heaven and the Muslim view of heaven?
Excellent point. You know, the Christian view of heaven is that you are going to spend eternity with God. And that's really what we are yearning for. Now, the Bible does give us indications of duties and things that might take place, and also some descriptions of this new heaven and new earth. But nevertheless, God wanted us to focus on Him. And how that might look like, we'll find out. But the beauty is we have assurance of eternal life and His presence among us. The heaven that Islam teaches is a heaven that is filled basically with immoral acts, you know, sexual immorality and pleasures with women and mansions and so on and so forth. And when you want to know where God in all of this, the hadith will tell you the closest you can be to God in heaven is like looking at the moon, because you cannot be in His presence. What I find it's really discouraging to me is that the God of Islam doesn't want people to have these immoral acts in here or drinking alcohol or doing anything like that, but yet He has no problem in His own presence, supposedly, in His holy presence, that people can do these kind of things as a reward.
Is there a resurrection of the dead in Islam?
There is. However, the Bible, of course, talks about two different resurrections and two different judgment. At least that's one of the views. Nevertheless, Islam talks about just one resurrection for everybody, and everyone will be judged according to the prophet they followed. Now, that doesn't mean Christians today will be judged according to the prophet Jesus. No. Today, Christians are infidel, going to hell because the prophet that came to them is Muhammad, and they rejected him. But if you lived at the time of Jesus, you'll be judged according to your works based on what Jesus taught you. And if you lived at the time of Moses, the same thing, and David and Abraham and so on and so forth.
And tell us a little bit about the 12ers, the Mahdi that's coming, because there's a segment, one believes in that, another segment does not. Is that correct?
That is true. I mean, there is different groups among the Shia, but the predominant group known as the 12ers. What do we mean by 12ers? It's 12 imams. So what do we mean by imam? An imam, in this case, is like the highest authority. Think of the Pope, something like that. You know, he's the highest authority. The first of those was the cousin of Muhammad Ali, then followed by a first son who was assassinated just like Ali, and then the third son, Hussein, who was also assassinated, and then everybody else came from the line. So they're all related to Muhammad through this lineage. And then the 12th imam, somehow in the 9th century, was raptured, believe it or not. He's still alive, but he guides the affairs of his people, and he's the one who's going to come back and usher the end times.
Now, is there any concept of Muhammad coming back at the end times? I've been told that the Quran actually speaks of even Jesus coming back, but not Muhammad. Is that true?
That is true. Muhammad is dead, and we don't hear of him anymore, except on Judgment Day, probably. He will be judged like everybody else. But you're absolutely right. The coming back of Jesus is a sign of end times by the admission of the Quran also. In fact, the commentators of the Quran on that verse in the Quran talk about Jesus being also the judge, straight from John 5, basically.
That's amazing. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. Al, tell us a little bit just about your organization. We've got about a minute before the break, but talk about Syria International.
Syria International, like I said, it's a ministry for teaching, equipping people in a variety of ways. I can do it in person, by invitation, churches or organizations, or I do a lot of videos and training videos that people can go and watch, for instance, on YouTube. It's called the channel called Syria International, C as in Charlie, CIRA International, or the website where we're going to have a lot of lectures available for people on our learning platform, also known as SyriaInternational.com.
And people can go and join the website, give you their email, get on a mailing list or something of that nature?
Absolutely. They can contact me through the website. I receive their emails, and I personally respond to people. I never ignore them.
Good. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to talk to Al, we've got about 30 more minutes. So you can get your call in now. And I'm here with Charles Stolfus, and we will be back in just a minute.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back to Point of View. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and on the line, Al Fadi. We're talking about issues of Islam, and in studio with me, Charles Stolfus, Associate Pastor of Denton Bible Church. Charles?
Yes, Al, just speaking of evangelism to Muslims in the Middle East, I know a story recently, a true story of a friend of mine who was an Iranian who came to faith, and he came to faith by having seen a vision. He had opened up his book he was reading in, and he saw the image of this man in kind of gleaming white clothes, and he told my friend who I worked for, a lawyer, and this lawyer was a believer. He pointed this individual, this Iranian man, to Revelation chapter 1, and lo and behold, if it wasn't, as he read the description of the glorified Christ there in Revelation chapter 1, it just lined up exactly to what this individual, Reza, believed he had seen, and he was converted from that. And we hear many stories of people around the world from nations of Islam, and they have seen, at least they claim to have seen visions, and they come to faith. Do you put any credibility in that? Do you see that or hear that?
Absolutely, Charles. I actually knew two people personally, one from North Africa and the other one from the Levant area. The one from Levant just recently got murdered for the faith, actually. But they both have seen visions of Christ, and they both, of course, connected with believers who continued to share what the vision meant and why the person was asking him to seek something in particular, scripture, or reminded him of an incident. But either way, this is just a sample of many things like this we've been hearing. And I emphasize, of course, as you know, brother, that people need to realize that just seeing a vision doesn't mean it stops here. We still have a responsibility to share the truth with the person, because the vision is prompting him now to remember a scripture, to remember a person, to remember an incident, but we still need to share with them. It's biblical. Peter got a vision, Cornelius got a vision, but they both connected, and Peter shared the gospel.
1-800-351-1212 if you have a question for Al Fadi. And let's go to George in New Mexico. George, you're on the line.
Thank you, gentlemen. And Mr. Fadi, thank you so much. I have an eschatological question, but I just wanted to say I rejoice in hearing the evangelistic part of this program. And I rejoice that our God saves people from every people and tribe and tongue and nation.
Amen.
I just rejoice in that.
That's right.
Eschatologically, John MacArthur did an excellent treatment of this kind of specific eschatology. There's a YouTube video with part of his sermon, and it's called Islam and the Antichrist, in which he basically, takes a look at the details of how Islamic eschatology describes the 12th Imam or the Mahdi, and it seems like in almost every detail, it lines up very specifically with what the Bible describes as the Antichrist. I mean, it's like our Antichrist is the Islamic Messiah, so to speak, and the Islamic Antichrist is the true Jesus of the Bible. And I had never thought of that. We in the West always just assume, a revived Roman Empire, it's going to be some European figure, but how quickly we forget that there was an eastern part of the Roman Empire, and most of that land mass that was in the Eastern Roman Empire is now Islamic countries. And I wanted to ask you, one of the things that the Bible tells us about the Antichrist is that he will make a peace treaty with Israel. And who would be able to have a realistic chance of doing that other than an Islamic figure?
Very good question.
In that context.
All right, George, let's get an answer from Al.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. I've always been of the opinion that unless Islam is weakened to the point where it has no influence whatsoever, I personally, I speak for myself, cannot see anyone will be willing to really step up to the plate and have a peace treaty with Israel if it's not coming from among an Islamic power. Now, I hope I am wrong about that, but when it comes to Islam itself, it is an anti-Christ system. It denies the Father, it denies the Son. Right there, just from 1 John 2, we have an answer about the nature of Islam itself. Nevertheless, it is quite possible that that's what might happen. However, what we think might be totally different than God's plan.
That's an interesting observation, and I know there's been a lot of speculation on whether it was a Jew or any number of things, but that really is an interesting observation. It points me to an issue that we deal with in our world today, and that is this intractable problem in the Middle East, that there just simply seems to be these persistent struggles between Islam and especially the state of Israel in the Middle East. Perhaps this is laying the groundwork for this extraordinary leader to arise to do what was impossible for multiple centuries, and that's to bring the peace to the Middle East.
Absolutely. I agree with you, Charles. And of course, I want to even piggyback on what you just mentioned, the struggle with Israel. People always think that this struggle happened in 1948. I would argue, and, humbly, I would say that this struggle actually originates from day one when the Quran was revealed, because it has a lot of hostile messages against the Jews. And Muhammad himself single-handedly fought three prominent tribes, Jewish tribes in Arabia, and annihilated all of them because he perceived them as a threat. In fact, Muhammad at the beginning was cozying up to the Jews because he knew the Jews are waiting for a Messiah, and he was hoping that he will get their endorsement that he is that Messiah. But when the Jews, of course, as always, asked for a sign, Muhammad couldn't give him one, and they also compared him to the Scripture, and they found him to be totally the opposite of what that Messiah might look like.
So, Al, do you perceive? We're working to try to get Jared Kushner and others a peace agreement there to create a peace agreement between the Palestinians, Israel, and others. Do you see this as fulfilling prophecy then in these efforts?
Absolutely, because here's what's happening, brother. The Middle East is a melting pot right now. In fact, it's on fire. It's a ticking bomb, if I may say. Really, everywhere you go in the Middle East, there is something happening right now. And it's at this point where we're starting to see countries like Bahrain and even the Saudi government are speaking just in positive terms about Israel and Israeli government. That's never been heard before. So I truly believe that such a peace is quite possible because the whole region is yearning for that. But let us not forget that Iran's still a threat. Something has to be done with that to tame the basically opposition.
Al, I have a question about the significant numbers of largely Muslim populations that have been migrating to Europe and to America. Do you see any significance to that beyond just an effort to get out of maybe a depressed era? Is there any significance to that in your mind?
There is. Now, not all of them, of course, come in here because of religious reasons, of course, meaning like they feel like it's a mandate for me. Not everybody want to leave their comfort zone and come to a foreign area, but they're being forced because of wars and economical issues and political issues like persecution and things like that. But nevertheless, the danger here is when the governments of these host nations, like in Europe or even possibly in the U.S., will end up really lowering their guards and allowing for these autonomous communities, and then slowly and gradually giving them like the right to practice their own Sharia law. And pretty soon you have their voice, and pretty soon we want to do multiculturalism and so on. That's the danger, because then our identity will start to disappear, and Islam has such a strong personality that the identity of Islam will become more and more dominant. And we have to really be on watch for this. That doesn't mean I am against the idea of Muslims migrating, not at all. In fact, I consider that an excellent opportunity for evangelism because they're here in your backyard already. But we have to also be wise and realize that there is still an element among those that still push for Islam to take over.
Al, in about 30 seconds, do you consider that a threat to the United States as well? Charles was talking about Europe and the migrations, but is that a threat to the U.S. also?
Brother, I tell myself I don't want to get in politics a lot, but I can tell you the politics of our day are very funny. In fact, there is a group of politicians out there that sometimes I wonder if they didn't even have a clue what they're talking about.
A lot of people wonder that.
Yeah. So it is indeed. If we allow that part of the politicians, to take over, then forget about our identity for sure.
1-800-351-1212. We'll come back in a minute for our closing segment with Al Fadi talking about Islam. 1-800-351-1212. You can go to pointofview.net and you can see his bio there, get information about his organization, and find out more about him and my guest in the studio, Charles Stolfus in Denton Bible Church. So we suggest you stay with us. Give us a call, 1-800-351-1212.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to our final section of Point of View today with Al Fadi, who are talking about issues of Islam, and Charles Sild joining me in the studio. Charles?
Yes, Al, before the break, we were talking about the significant numbers of Muslims that are migrating to Europe and even America. And I think you observed that in many cases, these significant numbers are not assimilating into the local cultures, the Western culture. Articles have been written, books have been written about the strange death of Europe in the West or the suicide of the West. What accounts for these liberal Western democracies almost possessing a death wish in terms of their culture?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. The book you mentioned, The Strange Death of Europe, is an amazing book that talks, of course, about how, in Germany, the Jews were actually part of society and they were annihilated by, Hitler, where in fact now Germany is embracing people who hate Germany. They don't want anything to do with Germany. They have no loyalty for them. And it's really a strange shift here, humanistically speaking. I like the fact that they love people who are struggling, but that doesn't mean you go all the way to where your identity disappears completely. So sadly, I can say this much, that Europe as we know it has shifted completely. I've been to Belgium recently, and I walked at least 6 blocks, and I saw nothing in these 6 blocks other than Islamic communities, restaurants, mosques, people speaking in my own tongue, Arabic. And I looked at it as a sample of what's going on, and I was told by Christians over there that they're taking over in a variety of ways. They know how to work the system, and they work it perfectly.
Let's go to George in South Carolina. George, you're on the air.
Thank you so much. I'm praising God for Al Friday for being so frank about Islam. I'm the author of Malice Cloaked in Liberty, The Killing of America, and I wrote some stuff about Islam, and he pointed out some excellent things today. And the biggest problem we have in America is like Omar Ilhan and Tlaib and some of these others are radical Muslim women who are in the House of Representatives, and he's right. If we don't pay attention to this stuff, it's going to grow. Dearborn, Michigan, right here in America, is now totally Islamic. The police in Detroit Metro are not even allowed to go in there. Beatty's Crossroads, Virginia, they celebrated in the streets and had barbecues when the towers fell. So they're here. And how we approach this, and the fact that we're not filled with hatred, we want to win everybody we can to Christ. But if we don't stand up to the influx of these people, and their desire is to control America. Abraham Hooper, who was the president of CARE, said years ago, it is our desire that America be Islamic in the future. That's all we need to know. But again, thankfully, and I praise God for Al Friday and your show, that you're willing to be candid and honest about this, because a lot of people are not.
Al, any comments for George?
George, I agree with you 100%. I mean, it's pretty, hard now. Once they're here, you're right. We have to come up with a strategy. And the strategy, in my view, has to have a different prongs here. You have to have a political front that will fight against any political push. And you have to have the evangelistic front also that reach out, despite the fact that you will be persecuted. Sadly, even in Dearborn, people get persecuted for sharing the faith. So you need to have these fronts working together. And at the same time, when they come to Christ, we have to have another front that can embrace them, disciple them, and also shelter them from the persecution that they will be faced with in their own society and their own community.
Hal, that's an interesting point, because you're a former Muslim who's become a Christian, and now you're out witnessing to people. Do you feel, are you threatened? Can you travel to a Muslim country now? Do you face threats?
Absolutely. I face threats all the time. In fact, I just did a series on critiquing the Quranic manuscripts, and I'm getting all kind of threats right now over this. But nevertheless, we thank God for the freedom that we have. But yeah, traveling to an Islamic country, I have to think a million times over this. I cannot go and really hug my mother who is sick right now. I cannot go to my own country, Saudi Arabia, where I was born and raised. All that's to say that Islam is not a religion of peace. It doesn't teach tolerance towards anybody else, and I have a death penalty on my head just because I'm an apostate. That applies to anyone who leaves Islam.
Al, we've heard some alarming trends in some senses, but we've also been challenged by the command of the Bible to take the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is freedom, which is salvation, to everyone on the planet. And yet we hear some alarming trends with jihad and some of the radicalized elements of Islam. Should Christians or Americans fear Muslims? I mean, what should our attitude be in light of some of these trends?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, brother, our first command is to love everyone. That includes Muslims as believers, of course. We have to really pray for them, pray for a change in their heart, but we have to also reach out to them to enable some of them to hear that message. But at the same time, we have to be wise. We have to also understand the role of the government as well as, our role that goes hand in hand. Nevertheless, the idea of fear, I would say no, that shouldn't be our first line of reaction. But at the same time, we have to be wise, and we have to be watchful, and we have to be careful. And therefore, we may want to embrace those who are reaching out to them with the gospel, and we may want to also support those who can also draw the line when it comes to political agendas.
Al, do you have some projects that you're working on that you can give us a hint about what might be coming out in the near future?
Absolutely. In addition to talking about manuscripts of the Quran and critiquing that, because that's important since it really shatters the foundation of Islam, I'm doing a new video series pretty soon here about Sharia law and political Islam and jihad and many of these things that will be, of course, released towards the end of the fall and the beginning of the spring of 2020.
Al, if there are Muslims listening to this radio program and hearing you speak over the last couple hours, and maybe they have an interest piqued in their own heart in Christ, what should they do to learn more about Jesus Christ?
Absolutely. I mean, we're living in a time where you can find anything and everything on the net, of course, but living here in the West, in the U.S., I encourage you to just go to church, go to a biblically solid teaching church. I'm sure you have friends that can take you. Get your hand on the Bible, read the gospel, learn about Christ, and watch the videos of apologists, Christian apologists, who have refuted these claims that the Bible is corrupt, that Jesus is not the Son of God, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, embrace the fact that God has given us the ability to reason and think for ourselves. Don't let others think on your behalf. Reach out to people like myself. I'm a former Muslim. I understand Islam, the mind of a Muslim, and I'll be more than happy to interact with them. They can reach me easily. Just go into my website, sirainternational.com. But at the same time, they really need to ask themselves, why are there so many Muslims leaving Islam and embracing Christ? That ought to tell them something, especially someone who lived in Saudi, the heartland of Islam.
It's very interesting. Thank you so much, Al, for joining us. You can find out more about Al Fadi and his organization. Go to pointofview.net, and we have links to that there. And we appreciate you joining us and just sharing so much with us about the challenges that you're facing and the challenge of confronting Islam in both our country and around the world. Thank you, Al.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Charles, it was a very interesting discussion. We learned a lot in these 2 hours here.
Absolutely. Al is very, very knowledgeable about this subject. I know at our church we've had him a number of times come and speak and teach on this, and in the near future we're likely to have him back just to inform us about this. And I just loved his evangelical perspective also. He's not just simply knowledgeable, but he has a heart to reach these fellow Muslims around the world. There's an interesting passage in Revelation that there's the host of heaven singing a great song as they look back on all of human history. And one of the neat things that is, they say, "Worthy is the Lamb who is slain, for you did purchase with your blood people from every tribe, nation, and tongue." Some of them will be former Muslims.
What a great way to end the program. Thank you, Charles, for joining us. This is Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby. We'll be back with you tomorrow.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.